Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can show appreciation by writing a review on iTunes or visiting interviewthefuture.com and becoming a patron. My goal with this podcast has always been to be a bit of a gadfly to your as well as my intellectual growth, and hopefully a midwife to your best ideas rather than a disseminator of a specific movement or ideology. Thus, while I've never hidden my personal views, I don't try to convert or make you a believer and follower, but simply to provide important and helpful people and ideas up for your consideration. Then, what you do, or if you do anything with those, is of course entirely up to you. With that said, my guest today is Émile Torres. Émile is a philosopher and historian whose work focuses on existential threats to civilization and humanity. They have published on a wide range of topics, including machine superintelligence, emerging technologies, and religious eschatology, as well as the history and ethics of human extinction. Their forthcoming book is Human Extinction, a history of the science and ethics of annihilation. An interesting side fact may be the fact that Torres has pledged to give away everything that he makes or they make over $35,000 a year. And in a previous life, they were a musician and audio engineer who sold a bunch of songs to MTV. I generally find personal details like that highly illuminating. That's why I generally tend to lock on them and want to share them. So, anyway, without further ado, welcome to Singularity FM, Émile.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. So, Émile, can you please introduce yourself in your own words? Let's say we meet each other at a conference somewhere where you're presenting, and we're at the bar or in the hall somewhere, and you have like one sentence or less to say who Émile Torres is. Who is Émile?
Well, I would say fundamentally the thematic strand that unifies pretty much everything I've done over the past, intellectually over the past 15 years is eschatology. And that literally means the study of last things. So, this would include perspectives on the future that are based on science and evidence, but also, visions of the future of humanity that arise from religious worldviews. So it's sort of, my focus is broad within this particular domain of eschatology: the religious, the secular, and the scientific.
Wow. And that's a big, scary word for a lot of people. It's kind of close, and it reminds me to another word that I tend to use sometimes on my podcast, usually as a criticism. It is an Aristotelian word, and it's teleology. So maybe you can kind of compare and contrast eschatology and teleology. Because again, to me, where I'm coming from, I often use teleology as a dirty word, almost.
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, there is a connection. Many eschatological narratives are teleological in nature, right? So, on the Christian view, one particularly influential interpretation of prophetic scripture, at least since the 1970s in the U.S., is that in some point in the relative near future, Jesus will emerge from the clouds. He will rapture up all of the believers who exist at the time, and then also resurrect everybody who has journeyed from the cradle to the grave since about 70 AD, which is when the Second Temple was destroyed. And that'll be followed by the Antichrist rising to power. The Battle of Armageddon will occur 7 years after that. And then there's this millennial, 1,000-year period during which God will reign. Satan will reemerge from the abyss. There will be a final grand battle, not between Christ and the Antichrist, but this time between God and Satan. And then the forces of evil will be forever vanquished. And, eternity begins. So all of that is to say, the ultimate telos, the ultimate end towards which world history is culminating, is this, this cosmic battle between good and evil, in which good ultimately wins. There's also interesting, there's a kind of scientific interpretation of teleology as well, which comes from a field of cosmology called physical eschatology. And this was really founded in 1969 by a guy named Lord Martin Rees, who may have come up in past conversations because he's also a futurist and has written about existential threats to
I've done an
humanity.
interview with him. Yeah. About two
Fantastic.
hours. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. So, yeah, he basically founded this field of physical eschatology, and then it evolved throughout the 1970s. And basically, it was the scientific study of the future evolution of the cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
And the standard view today is that because of the second law of thermodynamics, according to which, more or less, entropy is increasing within this isolated system that is the universe as a whole, and eventually we'll reach a state of thermodynamic equilibrium. So there's also a kind of teleological aspect to that. Sometimes the related term, kind of a little riff on teleology, is dysteleology. So it's this, the point being that the universe is sort of driving, has a history, cosmic history has a directionality. And we're moving towards this future state in which ultimately the entire universe will just sink into this frozen pond of maximal entropy. All life will be impossible, no more humans, and so on. So teleology, in many ways, has been influential. This sort of teleological thinking has been influential within this field of eschatology, which for most of history was a branch of theology. It's just an aspect of the religious worldview. It's the religious worldview pivoting towards the future. And then really in the second half of the 20th century, it acquired a kind of scientific basis as well.
Yeah, and maybe the origins of it were sort of proto-scientific, if we can call Aristotle to be a proto-scientist of a kind. And he gives a slightly, perhaps the way I understand him, kind of contingent meaning to what you describe, not excluding all of what you just said, but also he talks about kind of the ultimate fulfillment of the ultimate purpose to things. So, for example, the telos of a knife is for cutting. So the ultimate purpose of a knife is to cut, as he said. And so you have therefore good knives that can fulfill their ultimate purpose. They're sharp, they're strong, they can cut. And you have bad knives which are unable to fulfill their purpose because they're dull or they break and so on. And so that's kind of where teleology originates, the way I understand it. It's an Aristotelian concept, which was later on adapted by the church, and eventually, again, as you said, maybe in the 60s, filtered back in through kind of proto-scientific or scientific or neo-scientific kind of realms. Now, so what do you think of the following narrative? The universe was born without consciousness and intelligence. Eventually, it gave birth to consciousness, it gave birth to life first. Then that life eventually became both conscious and intelligent life. Then this conscious intelligence gave birth to machine intelligence. Then this machine intelligence started disseminating itself throughout the universe. Then we have a little period of, Matryoshka brains and Dyson spheres and, giant computroniums. And finally, as Kurzweil says, quote, the universe wakes up. So there is no longer any damn matter left anywhere in the universe because all of the matter has been converted to its ultimate purpose, which is to become smart. And so the universe is no longer a dumb universe as it started, but it is now a smart universe. So is that a teleological, eschatological kind of a story, or is it not? And should that be a form of a criticism, maybe even a put down, as I tend to use it, or is that an unfair attack in your view?
So I think there are two ways to interpret that. On the one hand, one might claim that there is a sort of natural or built-in tendency within the universe towards this future, in which, as you say, quoting Kurzweil, the universe wakes up. And maybe there, Kurzweil himself is inclined to give these kinds of nomological, we would say in the field of philosophy, basically just law-based generalizations, like his law of accelerating returns. And he said on many occasions that this future is inevitable. So that seems to suggest that, yeah, there's something about the universe itself that just naturally tends towards this future in which these biological intelligences create these artificial intelligences. Then they, spread in all directions, maybe at a large fraction of the speed of light, via von Neumann probes, self-replicating, and so on. So that's one interpretation. Another is just like it could be like a normative worldview. And so the claim there, it's not a descriptive claim about the way the universe naturally is, but it's a normative claim about the way the universe ought to be. And so, even if there's no natural tendency for the universe to ultimately wake up, again, as Kurzweil says, we ought to take actions, to ensure that this future comes to pass. So, yeah, I mean, I think in the first sense, it's just not. I don't think there's really a good argument for why that is, the inevitable. This future of machine intelligence is spread throughout our future light cone is inevitable.
That word inevitable really, really messes up with me. Like,
Uh,
and that's kind of a new phenomenon. I started off a little bit like a singularity fanboy. I met Kurzweil. I interviewed him over 10 years ago. Great guy, personally fantastic. As a person, as an individual, highly respect him. Enjoyed my time with him. He's very hospitable, very humble kind of guy. Like, really impressed me in all kinds of way from a personal standpoint of view. Um, but that word inevitable in the last decade or so has really bothered me. And in a way, teleology is kind of a synonym of inevitability in my book. And that's why for me it's a dirty word, because it kind of, from maybe it's my philosophical background that really bothers me, and kind of makes us like passive observers, or makes us, irresponsible, not responsible, and makes us kind of non-impactful in any way on the way of anything, right? It's like highly deterministic kind of a universe that we live in, if that's the case. And we're in for the ride. We have no say one way or another. And to me, whether from ethical or even from purely scientific cause and effect kind of point of view, I struggle to embrace that point of view.
yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I sort of share your being a bit frustrated or perplexed or whatever with this notion of inevitability. I mean, there clearly is there clearly are kinds of inevitability in the universe. So, like we mentioned a moment ago, this teleological future state of thermodynamic equilibrium, and so far as we know, that is the inevitable outcome of the universe, and there's just nothing we can do to prevent that. I don't know, maybe there's some like wildly advanced technologies that would appear to us as magic that we could invent to somehow it's somehow, I don't know, yeah, contravene the second law. But yeah, I also I find this notion that, I mean, Kurzweil's idea that this is inevitable, um, and that the push towards this sort of future is being driven by the law of accelerating returns, is what leads him to, I think, some like pretty odd predictions about the future, like the singularity is going to happen in 2045. It's like a very specific day and a very specific date. And yeah, it starts to his particular sort of eschatological, singularitarian eschatological system starts to look a bit like religion to me, including like these specific dates about when history rupturing events are bound to happen. So yeah, all of it's something seems a bit off about it.
On the other hand, people would say that the latest events and developments around GPT-4 and stuff are all proof of his genius and his kind of prophetic futurism, alongside his projected timeline of development, which many people say has been true and is consistently kind of affirming that it's true over and over again in time.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have particular examples off the top of my head, but I know that some people have looked at some of his predictions and found, like, I don't know, he seems to have been somewhat right about certain things, but also my understanding. So correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that also a fair number of his predictions have been wrong. And then with respect to GPT-4 in particular, like it's just not that clear to me that obviously there was this paper published just recently about sparks of AGI.
Yeah.
Being visible within this sort of GPT-4 system, but that also I'm very skeptical of that. And to me, one of the most amazing things about GPT-4 and ChatGPT, based on the GPT 3.5 large language model that they have, is that I really feel like the most impressive thing about that system is its ability to kind of trick us into thinking that it's doing something like thinking. I haven't seen much good evidence that it's actually sort of reasoning. And obviously, maybe people who are listening to this like understand basically how the systems work, and it's some computer scientists have described them as.
I have a very large number of my audience who are amazing, deep experts in all those fields we're discussing. Yeah. So yeah, many of those people would surely know exactly how it works or how it was designed, at least.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not. Yeah, we'll see, I guess. But it's not obvious to me at the moment that GPT-4 is like really is closer to AGI, or is this little stepping stone that like I know Eliezer Yudkowsky, for example, is worried that GPT-6 or something.
We're all going to die soon.
We're all going to die because that's going to be AGI. It's going to recursively self-improve.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I myself don't see it that way at all. I don't see it as an AGI example at all. I don't see it even closer to AGI. I think it's highly premature to call GPT-4 like anything like, close to being an AGI. On the other hand, I was rewatching and rereading Dune recently, and I remember that at some point they say there that when you've lived with prophecy all your life, the moment of revelation is a shock.
Mm-hmm.
So you've talked about the coming of the Messiah all of your life, for generations maybe, and then one day you see the Messiah, and of course most people would be in denial. Mm-hmm. Simply because it's too much to process, it's too overwhelming, it's too like you cannot allow that as a possibility even, right? Because it's still in the realm of kind of like it's in a different realm, and once it becomes the present, most people would not naturally go in denial. So I'm I'm fully aware that I may be totally and completely wrong here. That's all I'm trying to say. So anyway, we kind of sidetracked a little bit, but I think it's an interesting sidetrack and maybe kind of illuminating a little bit or relevant to our further discussion. So let me backtrack just a little bit here and ask you, going back to the topic of existential risk, can you share with us how and why you decided to study the topic of existential risk?
Yeah, well, I think it ties into uh, many of the topics that we've already touched on. Um, I think that existential risk had a natural appeal to me because, like so many other people in the United States, I was raised in a pretty religious household, and yeah, there was a fair amount of talk about the rapture. So the rapture is associated with this particular interpretation of scripture, which I had alluded to this before. It became wildly popular after during the 1970s, and now is like this very influential uh, understanding of what prophetic scripture says. But this framework is called dispensationalism, and it was basically invented in the latter 19th century. So before that, there was no talk of the rapture. Like the idea of the rapture was introduced along with this dispensationalist framework. And yeah, so I grew up, anticipating the end of the world at any moment. I have vivid memories of this. I believe this was around like 9 p.m. on whatever the exact day was that it that the presidential election was called for Bill Clinton, and I remember being just gripped and consumed by anxiety as a very young person, because everybody in my community thought he was the Antichrist. So it was like, oh my
Wow.
God, like it's really happening. I mean, it's sort of it gestures exactly what you were saying. Like for generations, for millennia, people have talked about, the end of the world being imminent. Here it is. It's actually happening, and yeah, it was really there's a kind of trauma,
Can you
kind of
tell me what
eschatological trauma.
community was that specifically? Is that Presbyterian, Baptist Presbyterian, or was it Catholic? What is it?
Not Presbyterian, so it was Baptist
Okay,
mostly. Yeah,
just Baptist. Okay.
yeah. So dispensationalism is embraced by people in different denominations, but it's very popular among Baptists.
Hmm.
So the Baptists are sort of more extreme fundamentalist evangelical Christians. So yeah, so I don't know, that sort of like growing up in this environment instilled a kind of interest in the future of humanity, which also I think this topic of what the future, in future studies they talk about the space of, they talk about the three P's, so possible, probable, and preferable futures. So sort of, I also think that those issues have a sort of natural, an intrinsic, are intrinsically interesting. So that also sort of, that fact drew me to this topic as well. And then it was really in like the mid 2000s that I read Ray Kurzweil's book, Singularity is Near, published in 2005. And around the same time came across Nick Bostrom's papers on existential risk. And so, there was sort of this like, eschatology shaped hole left behind from when I apostatized my religion. And suddenly then there was what appeared to be a scientific, rational, kind of evidence-based approach to thinking about, the future of humanity, to thinking about the possibility of apocalyptic events happening in the future. These would be secular apocalyptic events. And so, yeah, pretty much immediately I was really taken by the topic and got very interested. Initially, was super critical of the transhumanist worldview. Some of that was actually stemmed from Kurzweil's insistence that this is inevitable. And I kept thinking, like, what if we don't want it though? What if that's not the future that is actually best? Um, are there ways that we can, somehow put the brakes on technology? Maybe uh, prevent this, his vision of the complete merging of biology and technology, organism and artifact. Because perhaps that, yeah, that's not the best future. And so initially, like in the early 2000s, I've mentioned this on many occasions, I was really most sympathetic with what is called anarcho-primitivism. And it's this sort of, some anarcho-primitivists, um, like to mention this slogan of back to the Pleistocene, which is a bit silly because, the Pleistocene's gone. We're in the Holocene now, maybe the Anthropocene at this point. But, it was this desire to sort of return to nature. Like maybe that's where the most meaningful life can be fostered. And so that was my initial perspective. And then I read a book by Langdon Winner, published in 1977, called Autonomous Technology. And he was discussing this thesis, which is very relevant to the notion of inevitability, which is that technology at some level of development becomes uncontrollable. And so it's sort of the analogy that I've used is you could think of technological development or technologization as the movement of a murmuration of starlings in the evening. So that's just the flock of starlings. They move about in all sorts of different directions. The shape and direction of the murmuration depends on the individual actions of all of the birds that comprise the murmuration. But at the same time, there's no bird or collection of birds that's in charge of the direction. So maybe like technology is sort of like that. And yeah, obviously, if everybody around the world were to stop inventing technology or engaging in science, then this enterprise maybe could come to a screeching halt. But that's just not going to happen. And so for a while, I became convinced that a future at least somewhat resembling what Kurzweil prognosticates is maybe inevitable. It's ineluctable. It's unavoidable. And then I thought, well, if we can't stop this juggernaut of technology and science, then maybe the best thing to do is to join that team and to, hopefully like maybe modify in some way the trajectory of civilizational development over time. And, in a direction that, I, after careful reflection, think is most optimal.
Mm-hmm.
So for a while then, I really, really did consider myself to be like a transhumanist.
Mm-hmm. Same with me. And by the way,
Yeah.
you have a very common path coming from a kind of a very religious background. Many people in the transhumanist community come that way. And even in the non-transhumanist community, even people like take Michael Shermer, who is like the skeptic guy, he studied theology. He came from a very religious background. And now he's kind of the skeptic guy. So I think it's good to be aware of where we're coming from one way or another. And because, we all need to watch out for our own biases. And I come at kind of myself from a kind of a half and half kind of a background. Half of my family on my father's side were communists, and they were staunch anti-religious people. They made fun of everything religious and any kind of symbol or language or fetish, religious fetish and stuff like that. And on the other hand, on my mother's side, we had Orthodox Christianity seriously embraced by her mom, especially. And of course, those two kind of came into the family and created considerable amount of friction. Communism, anti-communism, Christianity and atheism. So I'm kind of like, but being aware of all of our biases and our histories should help us ideally beware our own biases and our own blind spots and hopefully make us better for it. I think that's why I ask those questions, because they are probably illuminating.
I do think it's also worth noting that, so on the one hand, there are lots of things that people don't like in the world. And one way to abuse those things they don't like is to use the term religion to describe those various phenomena. And So yeah, religion can be a term of abuse. So it's sort of facile and maybe kind of uh, unfair, I think, in many cases, to describe things as religion. But I think in the case of transhumanism, there is a really interesting connection. I mean, the idea was as I'm sure you know, and maybe many listeners know. So apologies if I'm saying something that's obvious. But I mean, this idea was like really developed in going back to the early 20th century by Julian Huxley, but as well as various others, J.B.S. Haldane and J.D. Bernal as well. But in a 1927 book um, titled revealingly "Religion Without Revelation," Huxley developed this idea. At the time, he called it evolutionary humanism, if I remember correctly. But the idea was basically the same. We take control of our evolutionary trajectory, and we through methods, the methods he chose identified at the time were the methods of eugenics, sort of selective breeding and things of that sort, to take control of our evolutionary trajectory and shape what the future of humanity is going to look like. But I mean, basically, he presented this as during the 19th century, Christianity just collapsed among the intelligentsia, and immediately, really at the end of the 19th century, you see all of these examples of atheists who are just absolutely fretting about the vacuum left behind. Like, what
There's
is the
actually
purpose of life?
a
Yeah,
very huge influence, even before Huxley, religious influence, that is to say, from Russian cosmism,
yeah.
which is a kind of a mixture between Orthodox Christianity and paganism. It's a kind of a strange concoction. Just like, I mean, many of Christianity's rituals are kind of adapted paganistic rituals, uh, localized to the specific culture or geography or what have you. So Russian cosmism, which had huge impact on, the modern transhumanist movement in general, uh, had huge, undeniably huge religious, at least sort of a metaphysical origin, if you will.
Mhm.
Not only that, but you know, I, I had a bit of a small friendly argument yesterday with David Wood on Facebook, and as usual, chatting on Facebook Messenger is the worst way to discuss or debate or hash out any such disagreements. So he pointed me towards an article he wrote 7 or 8 years ago about some of the misconceptions about transhumanism, and one of them was the very commonly lobbed claim that it is eugenics. And he goes very briefly to say, oh, it's got nothing to do with eugenics, and it's kind of like saying, oh, because Hitler was vegetarian, vegetarianism is bad. And my and I was not able to address those claims yesterday with him, but my response to that is twofold. So first of all, factually, it's wrong, and it's a myth that Hitler was vegetarian. He was not. So that's a myth created by Goebbels and Nazi propaganda, because in the 1930s the New York Times was creating a profile for Hitler, and they were trying to position Hitler as a peaceful man, a man of peace, despite Mein Kampf and all of his writings. And Goebbels thought, well, who is a worldly peace, commonly accepted symbol of peace in the world? Of course, Gandhi. Oh, what is one unique feature of Gandhi? Well, he's a vegetarian, maybe even vegan, actually, to a better word for him. But anyway, why don't we say and kind of try to equate Hitler with Gandhi by saying, look, Hitler is a man of peace. He's a vegetarian, of course. And so the background claim for that only comes from one article written by the New York Times in the 1930s, and it is factually wrong, because there's tons of evidence that first, Hitler was prescribed vegetarian menu because he had problems with gas and stuff like that. And secondly, one of his favorite foods was a specific kind of German sausage. You're maybe more familiar with the types of German sausages you can get, and I think that one had one of the major ingredients was doves, or something like that. I forget the name. Anyway, so that's a small factual mistake, but the bigger issue is this. Okay, so to disprove the claim that transhumanism has nothing to do with eugenics, we have to remove any overlap between the people in transhumanism and people in eugenics and their methodologies and kind of common tropes or memes, if you will. So first, let's look at the people. I mean, like Julian Huxley, you mentioned already, right? He was a very notable eugenist, especially at the peak of eugenics around the 1930s. He was kind of a little bit obnoxious about it, to the point where his brother one day got so pissed off that decided to write a book with which to kind of once in a way poke at his own brother, as brothers tend to do, and in a way generally dismiss the whole eugenics thing. And of course, now we know that book is called A Brave New World, and that was Aldous Huxley, right? And we know that Julian Huxley was a notable eugenist. Not only that, but he was the head of the British Eugenics Association or organization. I forget
Society.
the name, right? For a number of years. So, first of all, clearly, and by the way, Julian Huxley coined the term transhumanism. So, after that article or book that you were mentioning, so clearly, at the very least, the person who coined transhumanism as a term is a eugenicist. That's a fact. So now let's look at the kind of other overlaps, if there are any. Like, what are the major concerns about the eugenists and what are the major concerns of some major transhumanists? Well, obsession with kind of, what is it, the birth rate and the IQ rate, and especially the connection between race, birth rates, and IQ, right? And how we can manipulate those to the best possible outcome to fulfill some kind of an apparent, allegedly, fulfillment, teleological, eschatological end goal,
Mhm.
if you will, right? And so when you put all those things together, at the very least, you have to admit that historically, it's the same people and many of the same kind of methods. And, maybe that's insufficient, but it's at least, enough to make you dig deeper and sort of decide for yourself, I think, later on. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, there those are undeniable, and there's at least a very huge influence of one over the other. And there's more we can talk about that. Do you want to add anything here, or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I would first of all just say that interestingly, this is not very well known. So it's widely reported that Huxley coined the term, but actually the term was coined a little bit earlier. So it's a super minor issue, but I mean I was surprised to discover this. There's a really good paper. I'm forgetting what it's called. That was published several years ago, and I came across that, and I was really surprised. Without a doubt, though, Huxley popularized the term,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it was in his 19 was it 1957? I think
Yeah, it's in
New
the
Bottles,
50s. The
New
book,
Wine.
I actually have the page, but so maybe he took it from somebody else and I've forgotten or wasn't even aware of it. So please correct me.
Yeah, no. So yeah, I mean, just a super minor issue about that, which yeah, I was unaware of until recently. That being said,
So who was it? Who was it who coined it? Do
it
you remember?
was the name that comes to mind is Lightfoot, but I might be wrong about that. So I'd be happy to send you a link to the paper if you want
Okay.
to put it under the YouTube
Yeah.
info
Sure.
section.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, so that being said, yeah, without a doubt, I mean, I feel like it's useful to distinguish between methods and aims. And so you have like the first wave eugenics movement. So that
Right.
really began with Francis Galton, with his 1863, I think it was, book Hereditary Genius, and that continues really all the way up until like 1950s, 1960s. I think is when eugenics really came under a lot of criticism in the West, because a lot of people don't understand like eugenics was widely embraced by people on both sides of the political spectrum. So it
Yeah,
was,
yeah.
yeah, it was understood as like very integral to progressive social policy, for example. And a lot of this forced sterilization programs in the U.S. were implemented during the progressive era,
Even
the
in the
early 20th
30s, I
century.
think, like pre-war, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Really, 1920s, I think it was in the U.S. 1910s, especially 1920s, that eugenics really hit its peak. And
Yeah.
so during this first wave, the aim was to prevent degeneration. There were a lot of worries back then about following the publication of Darwin's book, Origin Species, 1859, a lot of worry about evolutionary degeneration. It was really widespread. H.G. Wells's 1895 book, The Time Machine, was a story of degeneration, where
Yeah,
humanity degenerates into
exactly
things.
right.
Yeah, and he was borrowing from this other guy, Lancaster, who was like a close friend of his, who wrote a whole book called Degeneration, like another chapter in Darwinism or something like that. Anyways, so that was one aim of first wave eugenics. We need to prevent degeneration, and then
But
also
I
the
want to
first.
put it in the full term because it's not just degeneration; it's racial degeneration, and I think that takes it a step more clear.
Yeah, so there absolutely was a racial aspect of this. And in
Yeah.
fact, one popular theory going back to the 18th century, popular theory of why different races exist, is that humanity originally started as completely white. And then it spread out, we spread out around the globe, and then various groups degenerated. And that's why you get various non white races. So it was just like you know, a deeply horrible view of.
And you had phrenology, I think, in support of it, didn't you?
Yeah, yeah. Anthropometry, study of the measurement of humans, was very much a part of this. I mean, during the Enlightenment, that's when our modern notion of race was invented. Then, what is our modern notion of race? It's that you can categorize humans into different groups based on mostly based on skin color, and then these different groups have certain intrinsic properties like higher or lower levels of intelligence. And so this idea that there are these racial groups with their own, cluster of properties that differ from other groups, this was like an invention of the Enlightenment. Before that, people would notice differences, but this idea of like, oh, you are a part of this group, and based on that, I can infer certain things about you, about your capabilities, about your, um, yeah,
And
capabilities, things of that sort. So that was really like, yeah, a modern idea that came out of the Enlightenment.
and the
So one of the,
implications are
yeah, sorry,
political
go
for
ahead, go
that.
ahead.
Yeah, yeah. The implications for that are profoundly political because then the next step from the biology, from the supposedly pure science, the next step is the master race and the slave race. And then the next step from the master race and the slave race is obviously Mein Kampf and the Führer and, the pure Aryans. All of these are just consequent logical steps, one building upon the previous one.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean it's worth emphasizing that the Nazi eugenics program, which is what most people think of when they think of eugenics, all of those horrendous atrocities, that was inspired in many ways by the eugenics programs that were implemented in the US, like in California. There were Nazi scientists who studied the California program, were super impressed by it, and thought, okay, we need to do our best to replicate that back home in Germany. So, really this sort of more progressive strain of eugenics is kind of the backbone of first wave eugenics, and then sort of Nazism and the particular kind of eugenics, the racial hygiene that policies that they developed, that was just kind of like a little side branch that just grew out of eugenics. And so ultimately, the point here is the aim was the perfectibility of the human species and the prevention of degeneration. And the methods, so that's the aims on the one hand, the methods were things like selective breeding. And so, on the one hand, you want to encourage people with so-called desirable traits to produce more. That's positive eugenics. Negative eugenics is trying to prevent people with what were identified as undesirable traits from having children. There's a problem, though. How do you prevent people from having kids if you think that they shouldn't, that their genetic materials shouldn't be passed down to
And
the
who
next
sets the
generation.
criteria?
Yeah, so I'll get to that in a moment for sure. Yes. And so basically, with native eugenics, like this is where the top-down authoritarian state control of of society-level patterns of reproduction become important, and those are really kind of the most. I mean, the whole thing is atrocious because of the underlying ableist, sexist, racist, classist assumptions. But negative eugenics in particular was where you get just the worst atrocities. And that's what sort of, like you were saying, you got forced sterilization. That's the Germans implemented that, just like the Californians. Beyond that, you've got like, well, why not just, put people in a concentration camp? Well, why not just eliminate people from
They
the
wiped out people with all kinds of disabilities and or mental or physical disabilities. They wiped them out, even if they were
absolutely.
of German background. They simply went to those sanatoriums and they killed them
Yeah, or especially if they're of German, you know, background. So
because they're
yeah, I mean,
soiling the race.
it was 400,000 were forced sterilized in Germany. 300,000 were murdered, all in the name of racial hygiene and
Exactly.
eugenics. And so yeah, so you've got these aims, and then this particular method, which is sort of built around selective breeding. Transhumanism is so there's lots to I feel like there's a nuanced way of understanding how it is a version of eugenics, how it's just another iteration of the eternal return of eugenics, as some scholars have put it. I feel like it's a really nice term because this idea of eugenics goes all the way back to Plato. um, and
The
so
Republic, yeah.
transhumanism,
Yeah. People
yeah,
with gold, silver, and lead and whatever, bronze.
yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, with transhumanism, you get a new goal. And people like Huxley thought, well, maybe, um, you know, maybe this goal of just perfecting, of creating the most excellent version of human beings possible, maybe we should actually aim higher than that. And maybe if we can use these methods of selective breeding, sterilization, although I don't believe he was in favor of sterilization, although he might have been. I need to go through the mental files for a moment, but to use these methods of eugenics to actually transcend humanity, to create this, in the modern phraseology, we would refer to this as post-humanity, the creation of post-humanity. And so so the original version of transhumanism was basically the old first wave methods of eugenics with this kind of eugenics on steroids aim. Forget humanity, forget perfecting the human stock. Let's just create a new post-human stock. you know, and then really you get this so-called second wave of eugenics, and that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s with the development of new technologies like genetic engineering.
Genetics, yeah.
Yeah. And so for the first time, people thought, well, okay, maybe we don't actually need this transgenerational policy that tries to, from the top down, control society-wide patterns of reproduction. Maybe instead we could take these technologies and in a single lifetime or over a single generation, if you're talking about a parent and a child, we could use these technologies to radically enhance the human species. So this combined the eugenics on steroids aim of transhumanism with this new methodology, which was supposedly liberal rather than authoritarian, right? So you don't need state intervention. In fact, the state should just get the hell out of the way and let people decide for themselves how they want to actually modify themselves or modify their children.
So what's wrong with that then? What's the problem? I mean, isn't the pursuit of excellence, as Aristotle put it, who was of course a student of Plato's, and kind of self-improvement and desire for your offspring to be better off than you are, isn't that like a noble pursuit that we've always tried to do and we are kind of all striving towards?
Yeah, I think there's lots of things to say about this. So, on the one hand, you had mentioned earlier that you had mentioned earlier this obsession with IQ and intelligence and things of that sort. Um, that those sort of tendencies, which I would describe as discriminatory. Sorry, I'm leaving the premise out there. So let me just say, so this sort of obsession with IQ and intelligence, that is continuous with the early first wave eugenicists. In fact, IQ was sort of developed in large part by eugenicists who had like super racist views, and who like developed this test that enabled them to point to different racial groups and say they are inferior.
We told you, we're better.
Yeah, and it justifies all sorts of then social policies. Yeah, a more recent example of this is obviously the bell curve. Where they're basically arguing against certain social policies because they aren't going to work. Why aren't they going to work? Well, because some groups are just inherently less capable than others. And so I think so bound up with that is kind of a bit of racism, maybe not just a bit. Also, a kind of ableist tendencies. Sexism was pervasive in the eugenics movement. Same with xenophobia and a certain kind of classism. And I think a lot of those tendencies are ubiquitous within the second wave eugenics movement. Transhumanism being the most salient instance of second wave eugenics. So these parents, want to improve their child. Well, what are the criteria according to which they're going to judge their child being better or better off than the child they might have had without genetic intervention? And I think that's where these tendencies, more or less insidiously influence opinions. And so I think that is one reason it's problematic. There's also a really great paper by a philosopher named Robert Sparrow. And I think it's called something like "The New Eugenics, Not So Old, Not So Different from the Old Eugenics." Mm-hmm. And he provides just a number of really compelling arguments, at least so far as I can tell, for why a liberal regime of second wave eugenics would actually have an outcome that's more or less indistinguishable from what the first wave eugenicists hoped for. Society would homogenize in various ways. So like one example of that would be, he says, imagine that you're a parent in a racist society, perhaps a society exactly like ours. And so you understand that you can't do anything to change the way society is. That's just beyond your control, right? I mean, you can change sort of, your own behavior in society to be a better person and so on. But, the systemic racism that is kind of like, in a certain sense, the foundation upon which the edifice of society is built, or at least our society as it is today, that you can't do anything to change it. So if you want your kid to have the best possible outcome, and you have the power to determine what skin tone your child is going to have, there's going to be pressure to select for, and maybe it just starts off with some people. Maybe most people resist that. Some people though don't, and so as a result, the next generation you have even more white people, and then within that the oppressive structures of society, those individuals do better. They're more like,
and then it's a feedback loop.
It's a feedback loop. And so it doesn't take long for there to be just, incredible pressure for then parents to not be the small group of individuals who are saying, I'm going to resist this, but rather to just conform, because you don't want to have a kid who's going to be disadvantaged in society, in a racist society. And so his argument ultimately is that you would get sort of naturally this kind of homogenization. And also there's a further point, which is exactly how liberal would this be? When there's all of this pressure to select for children who have, a certain, assuming that there is some kind of genetic basis for intelligence that is discernible. it's really, really complicated, right? That's a hugely polygenic phenotypic trait, whatever intelligence is in the first place. But assuming for the moment that you can select for that sort of thing, then there's also going to be pressure to select for individuals who have a certain kind of ability, an ability to excel cognitively in a kind of capitalistic system where you're expected to work a lot and where so I mean, and so on and so on. I mean, people can fill in the details because I think that part of the argument is fairly straightforward. But ultimately, his claim is that okay, society is going to homogenize. On top of that, how liberal is really this situation? I mean, there's a kind of appearance of free choice, but ultimately, like Ray Kurzweil says in The Singularity is Near, he has this conversation, fictional conversation with Ned Ludd, who gave us the term Luddite, and basically Ludd says that he something like I prefer being a biological creature, and Kurzweil says, well, that's fine. You don't have to radically enhance yourself. And he says, okay, great, I'll choose not to do that. And then Kurzweil says, but if that's the route you're going to take, you're not going to be around very long to influence the debate.
Yeah.
In other words, like,
there's a price to be paid.
There's a price to be paid. And so I think that little fictional dialogue between Kurzweil and Ned Ludd is really revealing. It reveals just how sort of illiberal this transhumanist situation would ultimately be. You either are enhanced or you get left behind. You get eliminated, you get marginalized. So yeah, ultimately, second wave eugenics and transhumanism advertise themselves as being liberal, and they argue that because it's liberal, and it's up to the individuals based on this right called morphological freedom to decide for themselves whether or not to upgrade to become post-human. It consequently sidesteps all of the moral awfulness of first wave eugenics, especially negative eugenics. But I think in practice, it would not be liberal at all. And there would be a kind of authoritarianism. It wouldn't be top-down state sort of authoritarianism, but it would be an authoritarianism of one's predicament. And so yeah, ultimately, I don't really buy those arguments. And then furthermore, the last point I'll make is just to reiterate that if you actually look at what the second wave eugenicists write, like the transhumanists, there really is just evidence of classist, racist, kind of xenophobic tendencies all over the place. And so even though a lot of them say, oh, well, we have thrown off, we've eliminated a lot of these problematic biases, I think a lot of that's just kind of lip service and doesn't mean much, because if you really look at their obsession with IQ and claims like Bostrom, from his 2002 paper on existential risk, that we should be concerned about dysgenic pressures. Dysgenic is a word that's just all over the first wave eugenics literature. Basically just means that people with undesirable traits are outbreeding their superior peers. He explicitly says we should be concerned about this. And then he says, if you look around the world, you'll find that areas where there is less intellectual achievement, those areas tend to have higher fertility rates. And so it just doesn't take much squinting to go like, that looks like kind of a pretty racist claim.
Right, especially if you dig out, or if he digs out, or if he says and kind of apologizes for, going on the record in a forum sometime before that and saying, I think blacks are stupid and whites are smart, or whatever he said, like whites are inherently smarter by blacks by one order of measurement, or I don't know, it was like 15, 20 points of IQ on average, I think. That was the claim anyway. And he said that he actually believed that, but kind of strategically, it was not very smart of him to actually share that position with people. So then you start wondering, like, can I really believe anything this guy says? Because maybe he just thinks it's strategically unwise to share what he really thinks from now on,
Yeah.
and just wants to to be the most efficient to achieving his goals at whatever cost, or omissions of ethics, or ideology he has to make, so that he accomplishes whatever his goals are. So that to me is a huge ethical and philosophical problem with the major figure in transhumanism. Combine that with my own personal impressions that I've had in my few dealings with him over a decade by email, I am even more concerned. But let's kind of reshift and refocus, going back to the existential risks, and then maybe we will loop back to transhumanism towards the end of our discussion. So let's see, first of all, how do we define existential risks? What is an existential risks, and what would be like a sampling of those in your book, in your view?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. So the term existential risk was introduced by Bostrom, 2002, and his initial definition was, the standard definition that he gives, which is often quoted, is it's any event that would result in our complete annihilation or a permanent and drastic curtailment of our potential for desirable future development. And so really that could just be shortened. The first disjunct there having to do with annihilation could just be deleted, because the reason annihilation would be bad is because it would preclude the us fulfilling our potential in the future. So then there's the question of, well, what our potential means. And in that original paper, he spells out our potential in transhumanist terms. So the definition could be translated, I think, to more accurately reflect his thinking as follows. An existential risk is any event that permanently prevent us from creating a flourishing post-human civilization.
Yeah,
So
and there's
that's
another paper here I'm looking at also called Transhumanist Values of
mhm,
2003. And he talks here about the basic conditions for realizing what he refers to as the transhumanist project.
mhm,
And so anything that is kind of um, in the way of the realization of that transhumanist project is an existential risk, because to
exactly.
him the transhumanist project is kind of the highest good, the highest moral value. Interestingly, not for him personally or individually, but for the universe in general, it
Mhm,
seems. I mean, I'm here combining not just that paper, but a few other papers, like the one on astronomical waste, I think was the title,
mhm.
where that's actually a lot more clear, right? So I'm actually combining a bunch of his papers here. It's not just exclusively derived from that paper, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So yeah, I was going to mention. I mean, that astronomical waste paper, which was published 1 year after the existential risk paper, it did provide a kind of different perspective on what existential risk could be, because it introduced this notion that, at least from a utilitarian point of view, and that point of view has been hugely influential within the existential risk community and among long-termists and so on. That it's really important that we colonize space and create the largest uh, population possible within our future light code, on the assumption that these future individuals will have happy or net positive lives. Then the total amount of value in the future could be literally astronomical. And so this notion of astronomical waste is that every hour, every minute, every second of delayed space colonization results in all sorts of cosmic resources.
Hundreds of
All
trillions of non-existing humans would not come to be. I think that's kind of what I remember. Like
Exactly.
every
Yeah.
second we delay that project, that means that 100 million, no, trillion, apologize, hundreds of trillions of humans in that specific future of having populated the entire cluster of our galaxy, or the entire cluster of our star cluster,
Mhm.
uh, would fail to materialize to existence. And
Yeah.
therefore, the total output of value, positive moral value, that he says, would not be optimized to its maximum or optimum level of possible achievement. And therefore, we have to hurry up.
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly right. So ultimately, then combining those, existential risk is I think so. The way I often describe it um, is that existential risk is commonly defined now as just any event that would prevent us from fulfilling our long-term potential in the universe. What is long-term potential? Well, that is spelled out in transhumanist, space expansionist, and kind of utilitarian terms. So we have this obligation to to ultimately become post-human, to leave behind the human condition and replace it with this new and better post-human condition, then to spread throughout the universe as much as possible, as quickly as we can, in order to, this gets at the utilitarian aspect, to maximize value. To create as much, if you understand value as happiness, to create as much happiness as possible within the universe as a whole. And so, yeah, so and how do we do that? Well, Bostrom, in 2013 introduces this notion of technological maturity, which is this ultimate goal that we should aim for, which is valuable not intrinsically but instrumentally. And because if we attain the technological maturity, then we'll be in a position to really
Populate the
ensure that
universe.
we colonize the entire universe,
Yeah.
become post-human, maximize value, and so on. And so ultimately, technological maturity is about subjugating nature and maximizing economic productivity. Those are more or less the terms that he uh, uses to articulate the idea.
And I hope our audience are able to see how our sort of original digression about eschatology and teleology is actually closing the loop here, because this, to me, in my ignorance perhaps, sounds extremely eschatological and teleological, and kind of almost ridiculously subjective. Uh, if not insulting, to be honest with you, from a philosophical point of view. Now, you can throw it right in my face and say, look, man, you have always had a contrarian bias. That's why you were called Socrates in the army, because you have issues with authority since the problems with your father, and going back into my background and this and that. And that will kind of be true. But at the same time, looking at the universe where you have evolution and the cosmos loving, the way I understand it, and loving is not the right word, but creating the space for diversity
Mhm.
and lack of a unified direction. But like evolution throws everything at the wall. Some things stick, some things don't, and usually many things stick and many things don't. But it's kind of like an expanding sphere of possibilities and options. Whereas so that's like almost an infinite sphere of directions and possible purposes and fulfillments and teleologies. And yet there comes Bostrom and says, here's the vector that is the ultimate vector of fulfillment for our star cluster.
Mhm.
And that vector has to do, again, closing the loop with eugenics, maximizing intelligence and birth rates for the highest beings that we can possibly create or design or engineer, populating everything that we know of in the entire universe that we can reach, at
Mhm.
least in the visible light cone or whatever. So I
Yeah.
hope here we have like a nice loop where it all kinds of starts coming together a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, even more, since you can presumably fit more simulated beings per volumetric unit of space uh, than you can, biological beings. And furthermore, since space colonization is probably, at least interstellar colonization, is probably impossible for biological beings. You probably need to be a digital
Yeah.
being. This future that's envisioned is one that's just completely populated by digital consciousnesses. And ultimately, I I think this is like a deeply impoverished view of the future. I mean, tying into this notion of diversity.
It's
I
a
mean, I don't
single
know.
narrative. It brings all that we are,
Yeah,
all of our humanity, diversity, richness, multiplicity. That's why I often say that multiplicity is better than a singularity. And unfortunately, it took me like many years to get to that point. But this is again a kind of a singular vision of a future, a singular vector towards a singular outcome, eschatological, which is to say religious in character and fulfillment, and not really up for debate or discussion or with any alternatives, unless you're a dumbass, unintelligent, non transhumanist, unenlightened meatbag. I don't know.
yeah. It's interesting that some long termists recently have started arguing that what humanity as a whole should do is pursue a two-step plan. The first is to reach a state of existential security. So that just means focusing on mitigating existential risks. So dealing with the potential danger of artificial superintelligence, of engineered pandemics, climate change, well, maybe climate change, and some other risks. And then once we get there, we can have this multi-century or even multi-millennium period they call the long reflection. And that's when we sit back and try to figure out what, as a whole, what values we want to guide the next trillions of years of future human evolution. And so that sounds pretty like open, and like the whole idea is that we join hands and sort of have a debate about what the best values are. But really, if you sort of look just a little bit closer at the literature, there are several pretty non-negotiable aspects of what the future ought to involve. And those specifically, those are kind of the three features that I listed before, which is transhumanism. Like Toby Ord, his 2020 book, The Precipice, says that it's very likely the case that if we do not transcend the human realm, then we will lose out on a significant fraction of our potential. So okay, so that's pretty. It's not categorical language, but it's like almost certainly we need to become post-human. Same with space colonization. It's like it's just not really an option, that for us to just remain on Earth, and to never spread throughout space, create these huge planet-sized computers, run simulations in which trillions and trillions of people, supposedly happy people, exist, and thereby maximize value. I mean, I think it's just widely seen as a more or less guaranteed way to fail to fulfill our long-term potential in the universe. So ultimately, what you get is this kind of rigid framework, where they're saying like, oh, there's all sorts of wiggle room. Yeah, but it's a wiggle room around this skeleton, which is transhumanism, space colonization, and utilitarianism, that is more or less non-negotiable, not up for debate. So you're debating within a framework, and so that's one problem I have with it. And to just restate what I was saying before, I mean, I think that what I think the the reason I think this future is impoverished is because of this rigid framework, because they're not willing to consider alternatives other than transhumanism, space colonization, and just maximizing value, which maybe is just the completely wrong way of thinking about value. There are other possible responses to value, which are not just maximization. It's a very capitalistic notion, and I don't think it's a coincidence that utilitarianism emerged concomitantly with capitalism.
And
There's just so many similarities between the two.
right, and there's other things that bother me with that is the sort of the mathematization of value too. Like the way he measures it and the way he calculates it with, like, you know, honestly, I'm very far from math whiz, but to me, uh, you know, putting numbers like 10 to the 46 or 10 to the 48th of humans, like, all these math calculations are at the very least up to contestation, and I mean high contestation, if not completely a, a guess masquerading as science. Really, honestly, I think that's the best guess of a couple of people, maybe masquerading as mathematics and science, which makes it even worse in a way, right? So you're trying to objectify and to make non-debatable the value measure of the entire universe, and make a one for all kind of an reach a one for all kind of an outcome, and support that with debatable, at least if not entirely manufactured math. It's really concerning and kind of insulting, and highly authoritarian and constrictive all to
Hmm.
me, like, so it really bothers me, I have to admit, like, I really struggle with it. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why. So let me just come out right clear here and share some of my other biases that I have, uh, with Bostrom per se, is the fact that he's been the person that I've chased the most to come on my podcast. Now, let's be clear. He does not owe me anything. He does not owe me an interview. He does not owe his time to me or anyone else. However, if you promise that you would do something, and if we book a date, and if we book a time, and if you say that you would do it, I take your word for it. And then if you cancel in the last moment and tell me that we will do it again and we reschedule, and then you cancel again, and then you refuse to do a specific date, and every year for 10 years you tell me, please ask me again next year, this year I'm very busy, please ask me again next year, and for 10 years, maybe 12 years, I patiently keep asking, and you keep refusing to me. And that's only, I'm not even going to mention some of the other stuff, but that to me is like, I try to stand by my word, I try to live my message. I'm an imperfect being, I often fail to measure up to my own expectations, and that's just the flawed person that I am, but I do honestly try to fulfill what I say that I will do. And when I fail to do, at least I apologize and I clean up, and I try to avoid false expectations and false promises. And to me, as a Socratic, and as an ethicist, in the ancient kind of simple worlds of Greece and Rome, where one of the most important thing of a philosopher was to live their message, that minor issue is a big issue. you know not living your message, not staying by your word, not being who you say you are. And then when you have like the fact that maybe you're like, at least at some point, believing that whites are smarter than blacks, and there's all kinds of arbitrary math and all kinds of arbitrary fulfillment of the universe, and all kinds of other things piling on top of that, it's like bad news after bad news after bad news. And I don't want to go after Bostrom here, that wasn't my intention, but I'm just sharing my own personal biases so that other people can first judge them for what they are, and maybe dismiss them as my personal biases, but maybe dig into it deeper themselves, and then judge based on his writings and his evidence as they stand, and his papers.
That's really interesting. I mean, it doesn't. Um, I mean, it comports with sort of other things that I've heard. So I've met Bostrom twice, and the first time was just very brief. The second time was at a conference on AI, and I went up, introduced myself, and and then asked him a question, and he said, which is uh, was perfectly fine. He said, like, I'm not sure I understand. Could you say it again? So I tried to elaborate a little bit more, and I was probably two sentences in when it was one of the strangest experiences I've had. He was looking at me, and then he just walked away. And I was in the middle of talking. So that also just kind of like, I don't know, that was just odd. That's,
I think that's another thing, by the way, that I've noticed in his communication and in other situations, and that's
yeah.
like looking down a bit, if I may say it. And I don't know how to say it any better or any lighter. But one thing that I loved about Kurzweil is that I spent 3 hours in his office and had to rearrange his entire furniture to make the interview happen and everything. And he was the nicest, the most humblest, the most easiest person to work with, even though I messed up, I made mistakes, I was like, there were issues. And yet he came in through as an amazing human being. Forget about
Mhm.
him as an inventor, as a futurist, right? Bostrom to me has come as exactly the opposite, unfortunately, from my limited communication and stuff. Uh, and that's very disappointing because philosophers are supposed to be better. That's what philosophy, in its core, the way I understand it, should be about. It's about, if especially if you're talking about the improvement of the species as the greatest project of your life, your academic career, and freaking universe, why don't we start with ourselves? And one measure in my books, and maybe not in his book, is being humble. And anyway, I'll shut up. Yeah, that's. I don't want to turn this as a rant against Bostrom because that's not how it was intended. But it's just like many years of frustration and disappointments, and lack of any being even impressed by his quote academic work. You know, I've done 2 interviews with his one of his best colleagues, Anders Sandberg, and my impression of him is entirely the opposite.
Mhm.
Anders Sandberg is a super nice guy, super friendly, super happy, pretty smart, enjoyable to have a conversation with, even if you agree or disagree. I just love the guy,
Mhm.
right? And they're best colleagues. And you know, Anders Sandberg said some very nice thing about Bostrom during the interview and said like, oh, we all accept and understand that Nick is the smartest kid in the block or in the department or to something to that effect. I have to go back to the interview, but you know, it's kind of like intellectual bow to Nick's prowess. But I was thinking, you must see something better than me because I'm struggling to see this, what you're referring to here, and maybe it's just my own lack of intelligence. That was kind of my conclusion, to be honest with you. So I was like, I probably have 20, 30 points down from Anders Sandberg, so that's why I just failed to reach the level where Bostrom's accomplishments are impressive to my limited intelligence.
That's
Uh,
so funny.
yeah. Where do we go from here? Okay, we go back to existential risk, perhaps. So let's talk about long termism and existential risk, right?
Mhm.
Because that's the next issue that's connected here. And again, it all is like sort of gravitating around the same gravitational well around which transhumanism, existential risk, and long termism all gravitate around. Oh, excuse me. Before that, though, let's touch a bit on utilitarianism because as a philosopher, that also bothers me.
Mhm.
You know, one of my also other favorite philosophers are living philosopher is Peter Singer.
Mhm.
And two things. First is when I had him on my podcast, he said he had no issue with transhumanism. But I think after my podcast, there was an article I saw with him where he was criticizing long termism, saying that it could be used to justify almost anything at almost any cost.
Mhm.
And I was thinking, yeah, this kind of a what people refer to utilitarianism in Bostrom is really a crude utilitarianism. It's almost insulting utilitarianism. It's very rigid and sort of narcissistic. And I'm happy to elaborate later on that. But I mean, let's just throw it in here. If you think that the that the universe's ultimate fulfillment is 10 to the 48 more of you, I would call that selfish and narcissistically pathological to the 10 to the 48th degree in my books. But again, who the heck am I? My intelligence is not Bostrom's, and I haven't been, Sweden's highest, highest academic. I was reading his biography before our interview, and he said he broke Sweden's national record of intelligence.
Yeah, there's no evidence of that.
But that's what he said in his bio.
Yeah.
I was reading it. And that's another thing which bothered me. I was like, why people say stuff like that about themselves? Like, what kind of a person you have to be to try to say that I broke the record of Sweden's national intelligence measure, however accurate that is. But if it is. Anyway, so utilitarianism is not as bad and as rigid. And Peter Singer, as a utilitarian philosopher of great renown, has pointed that. Right? And so all I want to say is that Bostrom's measure of utilitarianism is not necessarily accepted by utilitarian philosophers, and maybe even is kind of simplifying and crudifying what good utilitarianism is. And then again, as someone who grew up in communism, I'm always kind of a little bit pushback against utilitarianism, because there has to be some limit where you have a realm of individual freedom and choice. And so that kind of a 10 to the 48th maximization of procreation of more of me into the universe, yeah, that's what I mean by narcissism and selfish. Okay, this time it should be over. But this will be hopefully interesting and kind of engaging for people. And I mean, I didn't plan any of this, but it's kind of like pouring out of me because I've been sort of mulling these issues for a long time in the background. And they haven't even come out before because I wanted to discuss it with him. This is how I always prefer to do it. I prefer to do it face to face so that I give the person the chance to respond, because I'm a human, less intelligent than him, never broke any records. Maybe he can show me where I'm wrong, right? But anyway.
We just to be clear, we don't know if he broke any records. That's what he says. But there's a Swedish philosopher named Simon Knudsen who contacted Bostrom about this claim, because he said, I live in Sweden, I grew up here. I've never heard of any kind of like record keeping about. I think it was that Bostrom had had enrolled in like multiple programs simultaneously. And so it was like, he earned the most degrees or something, like as a young person over a certain period of time. But yeah, I mean, there's no, and it's so that makes it even weirder, because it is odd when you see a grown scholar mentioning undergrad level achievements. I mean, so yeah, I mean, there were a number of accomplishments when I was undergrad that were pretty noteworthy at my university, University of Maryland. It would just be odd to include those in a kind of boastful, vaunting manner on my CV. And then furthermore, if someone were to dig in to those claims that I might make on my CV and find that actually there's really no, this is totally unofficial. It's just this individual's guess about their academic performance. That just makes it even weirder. So, but I think that it is kind of an interesting window into, I think, kind of the way Bostrom, what he thinks of himself, and it's just an interesting bit of evidence.
I had a bias towards intelligence when I was 18 years old or 19 years old. I finished from the best high school in Bulgaria, the high school which gave birth to or was the intellectual cradle for, prime ministers and presidents for a very long time, whatever. So I end up I'm conscripted in the army. And in the army, I discovered that doesn't make any shit of a difference. Because you can be a very smart bastard, shrinking away from duty, trying to minimize your engagement and create the most safety for your own skin, while not doing any of the work, any of your proper share of work that you're supposed to do as a soldier. And so, in other words, you're using your intelligence towards, poor ends or selfish ends, ends which may actually put at risk the whole platoon or the whole unit. And
Mhm.
then you have those poor guys who probably, I was sent, I yapped too much. So I was sent in a punishment unit for 3 months. I spent before that 2 weeks in isolation. Anyway, had problems with my commanding officer because he told me I'm a piece of garbage in front of everybody, and I told him the opposite off. Anyway, not a very smart strategy, which is when I got the name Socrates, because people asking questions in the army is not a very smart strategy for survival. And being a Socrates is not a compliment, it's kind of an insult.
Mhm.
Right. And there's a price to be paid for that. But anyway, one of the things that I discovered as a result of that was that you can have the most uneducated and dumb people, if you will. And I say that in a non-insulting way, dumb in the way we traditionally measure intelligence, and yet they're very solid, good people who stand their ground, who are good friends, who are reliable, and who will take a bullet for you, or for their friends, or to do their job. And then you have those, people coming from all kinds of amazing intellectual backgrounds who can do all kinds of math or science or what have you, and then they're acting as total bastards and selfishly put at risk the whole unit for small personal benefits, right? And so that's the moment where I stopped worshiping intelligence and started, respecting more things like integrity,
Mhm.
right? Integrity is doing what you say that you would do the way that you say you will do it. Something which, in my book, Bostrom lacks
Yeah.
integrity. And that to me is more valuable than intelligence. But anyway, that's again my own personal biases here.
Yeah, I'm also just not even clear what intelligence means.
But
You
no
know,
one is. That's the
yeah, I
thing.
mean, there's so many different flavors of intelligence in scare quotes. I just don't. Yeah, I mean, to particularly like in the kind of the effective altruist, long termist, and so on community. Um, as we've said, I mean, intelligence is matters a lot to these people, and you know, Carla Kramer has pointed out in some critiques of EA that oftentimes, people will describe each other in terms of, like this person's really smart or less smart or something like that. I've been told that some in the rationalist community around the Bay Area uh, would introduce themselves with their name followed by a number, and the number is their IQ. And so
Yeah.
that's just how they introduce themselves. And so, but that number, like the number is to honestly, it's virtually meaningless to me. And if they actually
And if it
cared
has
about
any
IQ,
meaning, I apologize to interrupt, but if it has any meaning to me, it's detrimental because it shows me you have a complex that that you have to stand like a sort of a narcissistic complex, if you will, so that
yeah,
you kind of immediately want to distinguish yourself and make yourself special, and that kind of need tells me a lot about your psychology and your background and maybe even some other issues deeper than that.
yeah, I think there's something to be said about the psychology of obsession with IQ and intelligence. But yeah, ultimately, I just don't know what intelligence is. I mean, there are athletes who are, I mean, I would describe them as brilliant kinesthetically. I mean, they can just do things that few humans can do. Am I more or less intelligent than these individuals? I don't know. It's just impossible to say. I mean, it's kind of just a meaningless question. So yeah, for me, I think you're right that when I see people, occasionally, um, actually, this is true. When I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because I was a visiting student at Harvard, and I also was a neuroscience student at Brandeis University, which is very close to Boston. And so when I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's not that uncommon for people to have a vanity license plate, which is IQ and then a number.
Wow.
you know, and so So I
Wow.
agree that this sort of like obsession with like my IQ and joining Mensa and whatever is just really it's really weird.
But you can see how the next step of presumption in that kind of a twisted logic is to presume that the universe wants to maximize that,
Yeah,
right? So if you're maximizing for your IQ to the point where you got to put it on your license plate, or you got to put it on your bio that you broke the national record or whatever, then you can see how the next step may be that the universe wants to maximize that. And of course, the logical outcome of that is that, oh, the universe wants more of me. How much more? 10 to the 48th, of course. And if you don't believe me, you don't understand math, and you don't understand the universe, and you're a dumbass meatbag. You know, I get it. I broke the records kind of thing. And then I'm like, okay, we're clear now who stands where, right? And I think that's almost like conclusive enough for any observer to make up their own mind, right? So
yeah,
in the army, I discovered that I want to be a friend to that dumbass meatbag who has integrity and who has friendship and loyalty, and not to the accomplished intellectual who is a bastard and is going to stab your back in your back,
yeah.
right? That's what I discovered. Anyway, uh, okay, so time to talk about long-termism. What is it and what's the problem with it? And I want to set this up with a quote, because I mentioned some of your work on my Facebook page, and I had a couple of people comment. So one of them was Ryan O'Shea, and I hope he forgives me that I'm going to quote him. But I actually took a screenshot of his comment, and he said, I basically shared one of your articles, and he said something like this. A few points in response. Long-termism is a necessary and ethical approach to decision making. While it is important to address pressing issues in the present, we also have a moral obligation to consider the well-being of future generations. Long-termism recognizes this obligation and urges us to act accordingly, which is essential to creating a sustainable and equitable future. Long-termism does not neglect urgent problems. Long-termism does not imply neglecting current issues, but rather finding solutions that address both current and future problems. For example, investing in renewable energy not only addresses current climate issues, but also reduces the likelihood of future climate catastrophes. Long-termism does not deprioritize the needs of the present. It recognizes the importance of meeting the needs of the present, but also recognizes that those needs cannot come at the expense of future generations, and so on and so on. And so, long-termism does not necessarily lead to a dystopian future, does not dictate a specific future, etc. All reasonable things.
Mhm.
What's the problem with this?
I think some of it is wrong, and I think it also plays on. It fails to acknowledge an ambiguity with the term long-termism. So there's a moderate and a radical interpretation. And the moderate version simply says that ensuring the long term future of humanity goes well is a key priority, moral priority of our time. And the radical version, which long termists themselves would describe as the strong version, radical just makes a bit more sense to me. So it's just a terminological difference. So the radical version says that ensuring that things go well in the long term is the key moral priority. And so it seems like on the one hand um, he's discussing the implications of moderate long-termism, and so one problem with that is a lot of the many of the leading long-termists themselves, while presenting a moderate version to the public in the technical literature or in interviews with, for example, journalists at Vox, will say that they are most sympathetic with or endorse the radical version. And the radical version does imply that if there are contemporary problems, that if solving contemporary problems or addressing contemporary problems does not in some way positively influence the very long run future of humanity, thousands, millions, billions, and trillions of years in the future, then it should not be prioritized. So, yeah, on this strong long termist view, if there is a problem, a challenge, an issue that isn't going to affect the very long run future of humanity, or doesn't seem to have a particularly high probability, then it should be deprioritized on the radical long-termist view. Long-termists themselves have been more or less explicit about this. So, for example, in an interview, Hilary Graves, who's one of the more prominent long-termists out there, says that from a long-termist view, so she says, sorry, I'll say it again, from the traditional philanthropic perspective, it seems there seems to be a very good case that wealth should be transferred from wealthy individuals in the global north to people who need the money more in the global south. But from a long-termist perspective, she says, there seems to be a much better use of our finite resources, and that is mitigating extinction risk. And so, in other words, we have finite resources. How do we allocate them? Well, on the one hand, we could, mitigate extinction risk, maybe even like really improbable extinction risk from artificial superintelligence. Maybe there's even some concerns about like we're living in a computer simulation or something gets shut down. Those should be prioritized over alleviating global poverty. Because while everybody would acknowledge global poverty is very bad, if you take a grand cosmic perspective on things, it's just not that big. It's just not going to influence the very far future. Bostrom, in a number of papers, describes these sorts of problems as perhaps a giant massacre for man, a small misstep for mankind. Elsewhere he, in discussing like the two world wars, the AIDS epidemic, and so on and so on. These are, quote, mere ripples on the great sea of life, because they haven't really affected the total amount of happiness that will exist in the universe. If you take this grand cosmic perspective and you imagine these 10 to the 58 people living in vast computer simulations in the far future. And so this radical or strong version of long-termism, that is what a lot of the long-termists themselves have explicitly defended in the scholarly literature. There are some journalists who have, I think, aptly described moderate long-termism as essentially a gateway drug to the radical version. And it's the radical version that Peter Singer critiques in the article that you had mentioned. And he's echoing claims that I've made as well, that when you have this particular perspective on humanity, there are two problems, two dangers, I think. One is the trivialization or the minimization of contemporary problems that are deemed to be sub-existential or non-existential, right? So global poverty is just not an existential risk. Therefore, since, existential risks are they are just this qualitatively unique category, they matter way more than a global catastrophe that would just result in, say, like 99% of humanity dying out rather than 100%. Existential risk it matters more than anything else. Consequently, individuals who accept this worldview are just going to naturally be inclined then to kind of shrug off risks or catastrophes that don't threaten the entire future of humanity, don't threaten to permanently and drastically curtail the realization of our long-term potential, over the next 10 to the 100 years or whenever. That's when the heat death is supposed to happen. So that's one issue. And the other is what Singer makes explicit, which is that if you imagine this, throughout history, there have been all of these, movements that have been embraced a kind of utopian vision of the future. And when you imagine, when you see hovering on the temporal horizon a utopian world, and then notice that there are a bunch of people in between where you are and utopia is, and they're blocking your access to utopia, you may very well feel justified, morally justified, in engaging extreme actions to push aside those individuals. Maybe that means violence. Maybe that means genocide. There have been lots of genocides that have been justified in the minds of true believers by this kind of utopian vision of the future. And that's exactly what you get with radical long-termism. So really, it was around like maybe 2017, 2018, when I really started reading in detail the literature on apocalyptic terrorism. And it just like really struck me that the ideas or commitments that oftentimes were at the core of so many of these apocalyptic utopian movements, and that enabled these justified, so far as their individuals were concerned, justified extreme actions. Those very same ingredients are right there at the center of radical long-termism. So I also worry that not only could radical long-termism lead people to minimize things like climate change, which over and over again long-termists have said is almost certainly not a direct existential threat, but also could lead the right individual, so to speak, who finds themselves in the right moment to say, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to engage in some kind of extreme action. So
because
I think
the end justifies the means.
exactly, and you
If
might
my
even
end
say,
is the ultimate fulfillment of the universe, who are you,
yeah,
asshole, to stop me from it? I'm just gonna, you know, exterminate your ass.
yeah. I mean, the stakes here could not be greater. We're talking about astronomical amounts of value in the future. We're talking about like whether galaxies remain lifeless and going back to Kurzweil, sort of asleep, or if these galaxies wake up, if we're able to get there, redesign them, create value structures, which is another term for people, because people are means to an end. We're just these structures that produce value. And so whether or not the galaxies end up in one state or the other, is, if somebody's standing in the way of that, then you might very well feel justified in eliminating them. So that is a real danger with this ideology. And there are a lot. Sayer himself says in this article that it's not the case that there are long-termists out there right now who are calling for extreme violence, although I put an asterisk on that. But it's rather that the ideology itself contains these ingredients. The ideology is dangerous. And so therefore the propagation of this ideology is cause for concern, which is in my critiques of long-termism, I'm not saying that there are long-termists out there that we should be worried about. I'm saying that the ideology itself contains the seeds that could very well lead to violence. And history attests to this. This is not just me being hyperbolic. There are so many examples of this. And the asterisk I would want to add, the asterisk that I added just a moment ago, is that there are hints within the effective altruist or long-termist community, or rationalist community as well, of individuals who are starting to take seriously the possibility of violence. So Yudkowsky himself has said we should risk, even an all-out nuclear war, so long as some people would survive, to prevent the AI apocalypse. There was a meeting minutes from an AI safety workshop that was held in Berkeley that were leaked to me, and there were on two occasions in these meeting minutes, people suggested that maybe one way to slow down progress in AI, so that the value alignment problem could be solved, is to, quote, become Kaczynski.
Yeah, Unabomber again. A Unabomber
Exactly.
copycat.
Yeah. So already we are, when I wrote my first critique of radical long-termism back in 2021, that's when it was published. And I suggested that like maybe this ideology could be really dangerous. It could give people a warrant, a license to engage in extreme activities, perhaps violent ones. There really wasn't any trace. I mean, this was a hypothetical argument based on the historical record, my study of apocalyptic terrorism, and then just sort of like an understanding, a deep understanding of the long-termist ideology itself. Now, fast forward 2 years, there are actually individuals in the community who are kind of saying what I wrote back in the day might be said by some of these people. So More
And
than
if
ever, I'm convinced that it could be dangerous. Sorry for
no, no,
speaking
no,
in.
it's great. It's great. And if it's like people like Yudkowsky, for example, who have quite a sway in certain parts of the community, and you keep shouting, "Oh, we're all going to die. We're all going to die." And by the way, it reminds me greatly to Zoltan Istvan's The Transhumanist Wager. I was one of the first, maybe the first interviews that he did after the book came out. And I told him, I'm a transhumanist. I was considering myself a transhumanist at that time. And I told him I would have been with you until the very last moment of the so-called transhumanist revolution, and I would have kind of resigned and stepped back at your parade. Because at the end of his book, what he does is basically takes over the world, totalitarian transhumanism, if you will, shoots looters on the spot without any judgment, like proper, judicial process, but like basically executes people on the spot with robots or what have you. It's like a totalitarian transhumanist takeover, if you will. Extinguishes democracy, self-governance, personal freedoms, judicial process, all of these things. And that's the end of the transhumanist wager, right? Which was written now, maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago, something like that. But of course, Zoltan is the founder of the US Transhumanist Party and a very notable, media-friendly, popular, highly followed transhumanist. Now, you would say that's a fiction, or it's a novel, it's a science fiction novel, sure, but you know, as Greg Bear said to me science fiction is like the sugar coated pill. It smuggles all kinds of messages by sugar coating it as a science fiction. And so we have to beware that very much,
Mhm.
because at one level or another, it starts influencing our decisions and about how we perceive the options that we have and what's possible, what's not possible, what's permissible and what's not permissible. So yeah, so there are those streams in the transhumanist community for sure, unfortunately, which is one among many reasons. So I hope why now many people would see why I stopped calling myself a transhumanist maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago or something like that. I've forgotten. But unfortunately, I know time is advancing here. So while I'm enjoying this greatly, regrettably, I know you have to go soon. So let's see how we can wrap this conversation with the last couple of questions. So first is perhaps, what's the best place for people to find more about you and your work?
So I have a website. It's xriskology .com, and my Twitter handle is the same. And I am a somewhat prolific, for better or for worse, tweeter. So that's a good place to follow my work and sort of keep updated with things that I'm publishing and so on.
Okay, great. I'll take the liberty here to throw in a couple of quick ones, which are very hard because they're quick and they're not quick, really. So, because I've asked this question many people and I'm always kind of shocked. If you were to give me the top 3 highest existential risks that we are facing today as a civilization, as someone who is studying the field, what would be the top 3 ones in priority of like danger or probability or however you want to rank them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I do think that the possibility of designer pathogens is super scary. It doesn't get as much attention as AI right now or climate change, but I mean, it is a monster that is crouched along the road
So,
of
genetically
AI.
engineered pandemic. Okay, that's one.
Yes,
What's the
yeah,
second one?
I think climate change, because that is, I've called it back in 2017 a
But that's only a
context
mere
risk.
ripple. Come on.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, it's a frame risk. It's a risk predicament that frames the entire human situation here on Earth, and yeah, it's just not only is it going to cause just tremendous untold human suffering, but it's just going to increase. I mean, both government officials and climate scientists would call it a threat multiplier and a threat intensifier. So it's
I
just going to make,
completely agree with you. What's
yeah,
number three?
I would say AI, but there'd be a lot of qualifications to it. The thing I would say underlying all of this is what Luke Kemp, a researcher at Cambridge, calls agents of doom. And these are the generators, the enablers, and the drivers of underlying risk. And they include big tech. So OpenAI would be an agent of doom. It includes fossil fuel companies and then military industrial complexes. And I feel like that cluster of doom agents, they constitute, there's sort of another gestalt here, another way of looking at it. They constitute the number one, maybe you could say the top three threats that we face. If we don't get a handle on these military industrial complexes, big tech, fossil fuel companies, et cetera, then I think our collective existential predicament in the universe is a bit dismal.
Okay, let me share my take for a second and you tell me where I'm wrong. My take is that the greatest danger to our civilization is humanity.
Mm-hmm.
We know, historically speaking, there's only one Terminator species, and it's not the one from the movies. It is us, because we know that when we show places, North America, Australia, species start disappearing. That's the historical record. It's not up for debate. We are in the midst of the sixth extinction, the Anthropocene. We know we are the cause of that, just like we're the cause of climate change, just like we're the cause of soil erosion, ocean acidification, AI. We are the cause of AI, by the way, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
etc. So I would say the greatest, in my priority of existential risk, humanity. We are the enemy. We are the enemy. And exactly in this predicament, the fact that our ever more growing, because all of those issues are not different issues, they're the same exact issue, which is our ever more powerful exponential prowess to use science and technology far outpaces our wisdom to apply that in a wise, non-destructive, and non-suicidal manner. So I would say the greatest existential risk to humanity is our own lack of wisdom. And that's why I believe ethics is one of the way to maybe close the gap, because the more powerful we get, because many transhumanists, that's another thing, many transhumanists say, okay, we need stronger technology, more powerful AI, more powerful genetic engineering to be able to do what we need to do. And I say, no, that's only going to make things worse, because it's only going to make the gap between our power and our ability to control our own power bigger, not smaller. And the problem is therefore going to grow, not shrink. And so that's kind of like the gist of my take on the existential risk. Where am I wrong?
I don't think you're wrong. I mean, I would take issue to some extent with this notion of wisdom versus technology, but I do think that would lead us into a longer
Yeah.
discussion. But I'm very much in agreement that there's kind of a one-to-one correlation almost between the development of technology and the direness of our existential situation. More technology means we're less existentially secure, and so it's theoretically possible that we develop more technologies and that trend reverses. But I don't see any good reason for that being the case. And so I do feel really quite pessimistic. I mean, even people, it's a bit confusing. Even in the long-termist literature, people like Toby Ord have said that without this kind of boost in wisdom, how do we get that? Maybe we need to re-engineer the human organism or something like that. Maybe we need the long reflection. But without this boost in human wisdom, every century moving forward, the risk will increase. So he himself acknowledges that, I mean, everybody acknowledges that technology is the overwhelming source of existential risk. And so from my perspective, it seems like a really, I don't really see a good way out of this conundrum. We're going to develop more technology. There's lots to say about that. Some of it has to do with capitalism and and agents of doom and how those two things interact. But we're going to continue to develop these technologies. Um, at another side note, even though lots and lots of surveys suggest that many people, maybe a majority of people, don't want some of these technologies developed. There was a Monmouth, excuse me, I mispronounced it, a poll out just, I think, in February that found like a majority of people don't want OpenAI to develop these chatbots, but they're going to do that anyways because they, see dollar signs hovering on the horizon. So, anyways, we keep developing these technologies. I think the existential situation is going to become more dire. It's going to place the power to unilaterally wreak civilizational havoc in the hands of more and more people. And so ultimately, I'm very pessimistic. A number of interviews have asked me, like, what would you say to the younger generations to give them hope? And I'm just like, I don't know. I desperately wish I had something to tell them that was hopeful. But like, I'm looking at the world and, I'm a passive spectator like the vast majority of us are. And all the trend lines just don't look good. Terms of ecosystem collapse, sixth major mass extinction event, climate change, ocean acidification, soil depletion, deep fakes, lethal autonomous weapons, and so on and so on. The list goes on and on and on. And yeah, it just doesn't look like a good situation.
So what's the best way to wrap our conversation? Are you going to leave it at that? Because I always give the last word to my guest, and I ask them, what's the final message, or what's the one thing that you want our audience to take away from this conversation with you today? And obviously, this is a conversation that will continue probably around the time of the publication of your upcoming book. I would love to dive really deep into it. But today we had kind of a meandering conversation all over the place. I'm sorry, I probably didn't do the best job of kind of.
It was fun. It was great.
I enjoyed it too. I just hope it created enough value and reward for our audience too, because I actually was surprised by some outbursts of mine here today that I've had obviously kind of tucked away and semi hidden, at least from me, for years, I guess. So what's the best way to send us away? What do you want to say to close it?
um, you know, I mean, one thing that I have said in a number of articles is, with respect to long-termism, I think it's really important that we do consider the long-term future of humanity. I think we need to be a bit more humble about what we can predict and a little less dogmatic about what the future ought to look like. So that gestures back at this rigid framework of transhumanism and space expansionism and kind of maximizing value, subjugating nature, maximizing economic productivity, and so on. And I think caring about the long-term future of humanity does not mean that you need to be a long-termist. And I think long-termism, in its moderate form, I think it's deeply problematic in many ways. But one of which, maybe most significantly, is that it can be this kind of vehicle towards a more radical view. And I think that radical view, as Peter Singer and I have mentioned on many occasions, I think that radical view has all the potential right there at its core to be dangerous. To give people some kind of justification to become Ted Kaczynski.
And that's the small scale, but you're not thinking big enough, because with a justification that you're saving trillions of hundreds of trillions of people per second in that future of the universe, and maximizing their happiness and future value of the universe, therefore you can justify any crime, really. Any crime.
I don't think that's hyperbole. I think that's accurate. It's a genuine concern of mine. I mean, one of the risks of the future is, in my view, long-termism itself.